Hi, everyone. My name's Morgan Patelka. I am a professor of Japanese history and the chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm going to be talking to you today about uh, the origins of Japanese civilization and the build up to the classical period. So let me share my screen here with no further ado. All right. So, Japan's history is one of the longest kind of continuous documented histories of a nation or culture in the world. Japan has been Japan. I mean, it has thought of itself as a distinctive culture and country for a little bit less than 2,000 years, which is really unusual. So many places in the world that we think of as having distinctive national cultures today, like Italy, actually went through long periods of time when they were divided up into separate polities. And that didn't really happen in quite the same way in the Japanese context. But what I want to talk about today is actually prehistory, meaning the record of Japan from before there was the written record. The archaeological record in Japan is extremely old and extremely impressive. We, of course, have a long Paleolithic and Neolithic record that I'm not going to go into here because, in some ways, it's less clearly connected to later developments. It's similar to the Paleolithic and Neolithic records that are found in other parts of the world. Instead, I want to begin with the Jomon period, which is a very long prehistoric era that is grouped based on excavation of really interesting ceramics. The word Jomon actually means rope pattern. And one of the more extreme examples of one of these Jomon ceramics from later in the period is here on the left side of the screen. These are these coil constructed ceramic vessels that were pit fired and that have unusually kind of Baroque decoration, these amazing patterns, sometimes carved into the surface as on this example, but sometimes impressed using ropes, and these flares around the rim that look almost like flames or like some kind of natural pattern, almost like coral reefs or something like that, that could have been used for ropes to be tied through the rim of the pot so that it could perhaps have been carried or hung. But the truth is, we don't know that much about how these vessels were used. Some of them have repeated flame markings, which implies they were put in a fire, so they may have been used for cooking, but they probably were largely ceremonial or used for storage. But at the very least, they hint at a very um, rapidly developing culture. We believe that the Jomon people lived in what are called pit houses. You see an image of a reconstructed pit house on the right. The phrase pit house to me implies a really squalid kind of home, but the archaeological evidence implies that pit houses had walls and roofs, pretty good control for the egress of smoke, protection from the elements. These were only semi-permanent structures, so it seems that Jomon populations did migrate along with the seasons and then may have had camps with residences like this that they could have visited fairly regularly. Jomon excavations also have produced some really wonderful examples of these very small clay figurines, which are called dogu in Japanese. I'm going to show you two examples from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The first one seems to show a female figure, and the way that it's carved, the way that it's shaped out of clay, it seems like it would fit quite easily in someone's hand. So it's easy to imagine this could have been part of a shamanistic ritual having to do with fertility or childbirth, but it also could have been a toy, something that a child would play with. Um, an even more interesting example, perhaps, is this next slide, which shows us what looks at first glance to be almost a kind of space alien. But in fact, this dogu shows us someone wearing the advanced technology of sunglasses that are made using not glass, of course, but bone, wood, or shell. And you can actually see among indigenous populations in the Arctic Circle similar kinds of eye protection that is used during the winter, especially in snowy regions where the sun is so bright it can be almost blinding. You can find real world examples of people wearing eye gear like this. So this is probably showing the culture of a people who lived in the central to northern part of Japan and traded or exchanged with populations that lived in Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and even Siberia, and partook in a shared culture of negotiating snowy, icy terrains and had the appropriate headgear and clothing to do so. The next big period in prehistoric Japanese history is called the Yayoi period. And this period is defined by the obvious importation of new technologies from the Asian continent. This is apparent in, for example, the ceramics. As you can see from this slide here, the ceramics in the Yayoi period become much more regular and symmetrical, much more practical. Clearly, these are used not for religious rituals, shamanistic rituals, but rather for cooking, for food storage, and the flare of the mouth of the pot would allow for a leather or textile covering to be tied around it to close it off and protect the grains or the liquid inside from rodents, from pests. So this is a very practical and fairly sophisticated work of ceramics. The next period is called the Kofun period, and Kofun literally means tomb mound. And we see here a picture of what I believe is the largest tomb mound in Japan, the Daisen Kofun, which is located in Sakai, outside of Osaka. You can see it's surrounded by a dense cityscape. And these kofun are the first signs in Japanese prehistory of settled hierarchical society. Basically, these are tombs that were massive earthwork projects built at huge expense with enormous amounts of human labor and tremendous use of natural resources in order to entomb the sovereign chieftains of particular localities. And this immediately, of course, tells us that this is a society that is stratified. You will not have hundreds or even thousands of workers voluntarily moving rocks and earth and stone to create these gigantic tombs, which are as large as pyramids in terms of the total mass that they displace, just for fun. Instead, this, I think, is a clear indication, and archaeologists have argued this is a clear indication of social stratification, of hierarchy, of a society in which rulers can command the bodies and the labor of large numbers of inferiors or followers. And indeed, there are records for the first time in this era from the Chinese continent that indicate that there is a kingdom in southern Japan that the Chinese call the Kingdom of Wa, and that there is some diplomatic exchange. There also are records from the Korean peninsula, which is divided up into separate kingdoms during this period, that indicate that there is significant exchange of people and goods between the Korean peninsula kingdoms and the emerging chieftains and their polities on the Japanese archipelago. So this leads us into the first sort of semi-historic period of Japanese history, when it's believed that the first largely unified state to gain prominence in Japan, which is the ancestor of the imperial line that still rules, at least symbolically, Japan today, and that's known as the Yamato Kingdom or the Yamato polity, that seems to have managed to have unified about half of what we now think of as Japan, as you can see on this map. There was a pocket of resistance in the southernmost island of Kyushu, And the indigenous peoples, the population that lived in Japan before the arrival of waves of migrants from the continent, who are known in the pre-modern past as the Emishi, but may be related to the population known today as the Ainu, uh, occupied the northern part of the Japanese archipelago. So this is the beginning of, in a sense, Japan as a coherent and distinctive polity and culture. And we start to have historical records from the 6th century that indicate that one of the ways that this polity, the Yamato kingdom, was able to emerge was through using technologies and ideas, social and political structures that were imported from the Asian continent, especially from Korea, and through Korea from China. So we find bountiful evidence that Buddhist texts and material culture came to Japan in the early 6th century, including in particular Buddhist statuary, other forms of Buddhist material culture, and sutras and other forms of Buddhist scripture. By the late 6th to early 7th centuries, Common Era, we start to have the historical record, the relatively reliable historical record of this emerging polity become clearer. So for example, between 592 and 628, we know about the reign of a sovereign who ruled over the Japanese polity at that time, named Empress Suiko. It's really interesting to note that although today there's significant controversy in Japan about the idea of an empress possibly taking the throne, which is of course just a symbolic position in Japan today, but is still very important as a symbol of Japanese culture and Japanese history. There's controversy about the idea of the reigning monarch being a woman, but there's ample evidence that in the pre-modern period there were moments when women did rule over the polity, and this is particularly clear in the earliest centuries of that polity, when there seems to have been a kind of conflict between imported Chinese and Korean notions of statehood and sovereignty that were based in Confucianism, that really emphasized the political primacy of men, versus native Japanese cultural structures that seem to have allowed for, if not matriarchy, at least matrilineal rulership and women with a kind of shamanistic authority being in positions of political power. However, Empress Suiko appointed her nephew, who's known to us today as Prince Shotoku or Shotoku Taishi, to be regent and to be the kind of political arm of her regime. And he proved to be, at least according to the kind of standard narratives of Japanese history, tremendously influential for the roughly 50 years during which he served as regent. He's believed to have sponsored major reforms of the new emerging Japanese state, including the adoption of various Confucian political structures and hierarchies in the court that in some ways helped to define what the Japanese state in the classical period would look like. And this system, which eventually is called the Ritsuryo system, becomes the kind of classical governmental model that is the foundation for later governments, even though it's transformed in various ways and it evolves, of course, a lot over time. So Japan, in its earliest periods, had the polity's center of gravity in what is classically the center, considered the center of Japan, which is essentially the area between Osaka, Nara, and Kyoto. This region is called the Kansai region or the Kinki region, and it was home to the earliest sovereigns who were connected, as mentioned before, in various ways to the emerging Korean kingdom. Some scholars even argue they may have been Korean migrant leaders who helped to unify this emerging Japanese polity. Over time, regardless of their origins or their historical ethnicity, this became the Japanese imperial family. And part of how the imperial family distinguished itself in the early years was through relocating the capital when there were times of political change. So, for example, we have the early capital of Asuka. There are a number of emperors or sovereigns who ruled during the 150 to 60 year period of the Asuka period, who had their capitals located in the southern part of this agricultural basin. We have the Heijo capital, which is known to us as Nara, and which I'll talk about in a moment. After the Nara period, very briefly, the capital relocated to Nagaoka to the north. And then finally, for the longest period of Japanese history, the capital was located in Kyoto, known historically as Heian, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture. For now, let's focus on Nara, also known as Heijo, which was the capital of Japan for less than a century, but which had a huge influence on Japanese culture and is a major tourist destination today. Nara is familiar to most people who visit Japan in the 21st century because of its incredible Buddhist temple complexes. It's beautiful and very accessible downtown, and the plethora of deer who are allowed to roam wild and are protected in downtown Nara, and who delight and terrify tourists with their hunger and with their brazen willingness to walk amidst enormous crowds. Nara has one in particularly distinctive landmark, which is this temple, Todaiji, the Great Eastern Temple, which is the largest wooden structure in the world. It's truly a remarkable monument. And this is actually a later reconstruction of what was an even larger temple. The original Todaiji was a third larger than what you see on the screen. You can tell how large this is by looking at the tiny, tiny people down at the base. And this is a temple that houses an enormous statue of the Buddha, and it was constructed by the imperial court, which used Buddhism in some ways to buttress their political authority, to mark themselves as sovereigns blessed by the Buddha and part of this Buddhist cosmology, and the impact you can imagine on rural people, on agriculturalists, on those who for whom all of this Chinese and Korean Buddhist and Confucian material culture, architecture, and ideas were relatively new. You can imagine how overawed people must have felt coming into the city and going on a pilgrimage to a temple like this. The power that was projected is new and truly magnificent. Here's an image of the Amida Buddha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise, inside the temple, an absolutely enormous figure who you feel a sense of majesty emanating out of it when you visit and when you walk into the inner hall. Here you can see a group of school children visiting, sitting on the upper platform at the feet of the Buddha, hearing a lecture from the priest. So it's still today is a major tourist destination, as well as a destination for Japanese people learning about their own history and culture. So Nara was the capital until the end of the 8th century, but one of the things that these incredible temples ended up allowing was the abbots, the Buddhist priests who were in charge of Todaiji and the other Buddhist temples in Nara, became so influential because of the majesty of these structures and the influence of their teachings, that they started to meddle in court politics. They started to get involved in the ruling of the nation, and this created a desire in the imperial family for change, for a political capital that was not dominated by these giant temples that they themselves had sponsored and built, but instead a city that they could control and manage, and in theory keep free from the influence of meddling religious institutions. And that will lead us pretty cleanly into discussion of the next capital, Heian-kyo, or Kyoto, which I will talk about in the next lecture. All right, I look forward to our discussion in person. That's it for today. Thank you.